Welcome to a very unique episode of Gospelbound. My name is Jim Davis, pastor of Orlando Grace Church and host of the As in Heaven podcast here at TGC. And I am joined today by a first-time guest, Colin Hanson, Vice President of Content and Chief Editor of the Gospel Coalition. Colin, thank you for joining us.
This is a little weird, Jim, but I'm glad to be here.
To make it a little weirder, I'll tell you, we're in full emergency mode here in not so sunny Orlando. We have storms and thunder and tornadoes. So if you hear a little rain or falling trees, that's what's going on here. Well, as many of your listeners really know, this is Colin's podcast where he is normally the host, but today we are trading seats and I get to interview him about his forthcoming book, Tim Keller, His Spiritual and Intellectual Formation, published by Zondervan. You know, Colin, I've said this often, that 500 years from now, I think maybe two pastors or theologians will be remembered, and I really do believe that Tim Keller is one of those people. The influence that he has had in the 21st century, it really is hard to overstate, from his sermons, his books, his speaking, and his influence in founding TGC, Redeemer Church, Redeemer City to City, just to mention a few. And it's fascinating to me when I travel overseas, not only to see that he's known there, but that he's widely read in a wide variety of theological streams. So it's easy to see that Tim has had influence on many. But in Colin's new book, we get to see who influenced Tim and helped make Tim who he is. So, Colin, I know Tim has had a big influence on you. Can you tell us how exactly he has had an influence on you and how you decided to write this book?
So I got to know Tim in 2007. I was working on my first book, Young Restless Reformed, and I ran up to him at a Gospel Coalition conference. In fact, it was the first Gospel Coalition conference. It was held at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And I was just about to start there as a student, and I said, "Hey, I'm working on this book. I'd like to be interviewed, or I'd like to interview you." And keep in mind, Tim was not a really well-known figure at the time. I'd heard reference to him. Christianity Today had covered him. I think Andy Crouch had written about him, and we knew a lot about him just because of 9/11 and things like that. And maybe I'd heard about a book that was coming out next year. That was The Reason for God. In 2008, he published both The Prodigal God and The Reason for God. And so a big year. Yeah, no doubt about it. So I asked him about this, and he said, "Yeah, I mean, I'm not really interested in doing that interview, but you can send me some questions." So I sent him some questions, and he responded with one-word answers. Thank you, Tim. So I pretty much went ahead with that book without a lot of mention of Tim. And but from there, we actually began to work on a series of books together. And it was a series of books based on different aspects of cultural engagement. We edited a book together by Michael Gerson and Pete Weiner called City of Man, about politics. Did a couple more of those as well, culminated in my book Blind Spots in 2015, which is just kind of ripping off some aspects of what Tim has talked about in places like Center Church. And so then also through the Gospel Coalition, we had been working together for a long period of time. But I would say that the number one area that has struck me about Tim from the beginning was the way he articulates the concept of theological vision, and especially the way he lays that out in the Gospel Coalition's foundation documents. I had just never seen anything like that before, Jim. The way that you could have a positive but also critical approach to culture from a theological foundation that would shape your life and your ministry. I just had never seen something like that before, and that was the number one area. And then I think, Jim, I was just the right age, because mentioned right there in the seminary, you've got his first two books come out, and then it has just been a parade of hits since then. Center Church comes out when I'm early at TGC and early in ministry, and everything else, Meaning of Marriage, in 2012, and I remember that was when I was living out in New York City area, and then we brought we used some of Kathy Keller's advice for a friend of ours who was living with a man that she was engaged to, but he was not a Christian. She broke up with him on Kathy's advice. I mean, there were just all kinds of things, and so much of my ministry since my mid-20s has been against the backdrop of Tim's publishing and just the rise of the Gospel Coalition, and so it's been a major influence. I think certainly the biggest influence on my life.